let's start the session in the best note possible by listening to Professor Indu Agnihotri. It is my pleasure to introduce and welcome Professor Indu Agnihotri to today's online gathering. An integral part of women's movement in India and an important contributor to how women's studies have evolved in this country. Professor Indu Agnihotri engages with gender in its various dimensions in her work. She is the former director of the Center for Women's Development Studies, New Delhi, and her research interests include women's studies, gender and labor, migration, violence against women, and the women's movement in India. Without further ado, and with much happiness, I invite Professor Indu Agnihotri to deliver the keynote address.
Can you hear us, ma'am?
Well, it had gone for some time, but it has just come back. Can you hear me?
Yes, you can hear you.
Okay. I couldn't get what was being said in the last few minutes because my audio was gone for some reason. Yeah.
Ma'am,
we were introducing you.
Okay, thank you. So do you want me to start now? Yeah? Okay. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you to the organizers, to the University for Science and Technology, Kerala, for organizing this program. Can you hear? I just want to check because I'm not sure what's happening. Yeah?
Yes.
Okay. I have to say that I'm glad I joined the session when it began because it was a pleasure to listen to the minister particularly. I have met her on one or two occasions, but it was really a pleasure because such thoughts are not very easily to be heard in my part of the world, part of the country, let us say. These days, in fact, we hear very, very hostile and very antagonistic sort of opinions. I think it's important that we're holding this program in this context because, in India, we are very I don't want to say parochial in a bad way, but sometimes we are too located in our context and we don't understand what is happening in other parts of the country. Sometimes I have found, and it works both ways, be it the north or the south, that we really don't know enough about each other and we don't understand or are not sensitive to the signals that are coming in different regional locations or at the national level also. So it is very, very important that we are holding this program. When I speak today, I will broadly be speaking from a sort of straddling both the world of women's studies and women's activism and the movement, because that has been my own journey. So I come from my own journey, from my own location, to speak to these younger participants who really represent a ray of hope to those forces in the country who are looking for social change and who are looking for social change which will take us in a direction where, whether it is debates, whether it's differences, whether it is assertion of identity, whether it is assertion of a kind of national identity, an individual identity, a gender identity, but that there will be an openness to discussions, an openness to embrace the views and be patient, tolerant, listen to other views, and also be willing to negotiate despite agreements or disagreements. I think that today, especially in the university space, is very, very important because I think that is where we get that training. when we come into a university or a campus environment as students, we come from different social backgrounds, we come from different linguistic backgrounds, we come from different economic backgrounds. But there is an exposure to a set of ideas that itself is important and necessary, and we may embrace them with a different approach, each one. We don't all have to agree, but that willingness to listen, to be tolerant of other opinions, willingness to and commitment to even assert your voice and disagree, even that is important. And I think that is something that the university environment must guard. Not only guard, it should sort of openly, proactively provide that kind of a platform. And I hope that even in this program we will have that. Why am I saying that? Because, when we talk about women in India, there are any number of ways of approaching it. I may have a particular approach, and I may definitely think that my approach is correct. But what we are seeing today is a discourse at a totally different level, which is arguing against any kind of change of ideas, any kind of change of roles, a challenge to stereotypes, and it is trying to project all these assertions and new negotiations, which are part of the aspirations of the youth. They were also aspirations of my generation when we were younger, but the aspirations of the youth have to be given that space, and they have to be given that space through a dialogue around forms of not just modernization in terms of the economy, in terms of industry or technology, but in terms of modernity of ideas. Why I'm bringing this in is because I have found that over the last 2-3 years, particularly when the environment has got more vitiated in other spaces, Kerala has also seen very, very hectic, heated debates around it. But I myself, for instance, have been invited earlier also to university campus when we were not necessarily functioning in the virtual mode, where we have had discussions on the Renaissance, on Nav Keralam, so many of those ideas. And I think those debates are very, very important. So that is one of the first statements that I would like to convey to all of you who are participating in this program, that treasure this, build on it, because we do not know when this may be sought to be taken away from us. From my own background of my student days in one of the most prestigious and what is seen as a radical university at the Jawaharlal Nehru University, we could not have imagined the kind of crushing and the silencing of debate, silencing of dissent that is sought to be imposed in present day India. And I think for that reason, when I speak to you, I say, don't come with fixed ideas, don't go with fixed ideas. Discuss, debate, question. Even if I'm speaking to you, do have a discussion on it. But treasure this space that you have, because what is going around in this region, we know what is happening across the borders. It is so worrisome. It's an understatement. We need to be sure that we guard the spaces and the rights that we have won. Now, when I talk about women, it is important that this is kept in mind, that women are not to be looked at, not to be seen, not to be understood in terms of their position, their role, their contribution in isolation. Women are a part of this society. Women are a part of everything that society is about. So it is not as if we have to study women in isolation or see them in isolation. We have to study them with a specificity of focus. which is inclusive of that larger context. So when I say the larger context, we have to keep in mind that there is a history. That historical context has to be kept in mind, and that historical context is also diverse, it is also specific, it changes. I've been a student of ancient history, I've also been a student of modern history, I've taught Indian, European history. It's all, during a 40, 50-year-old academic journey, you cover many aspects. And the one thing that we have to respect is the diversity of tradition. What is being sought to be presented to us through certain official interventions today is to erase this diversity. Why am I saying that we need to be alert to it? Because we should also not reproduce those homogeneous or universalistic perceptions. What I'm saying is, for instance, when I come to more specific ideas and discussing those, this whole notion of being anti-women, we would be wrong in our approach if we were to think that we should homogeneously represent India and Indian history and Indian society as having always been anti-women, as always having been anti-women in a very specific way. Yes, as the minister said, and as many of us and all our scholarship shows, patriarchy is something that we have seen in all societies. It exists in all societies, but it exists in different ways. The kind of patriarchy we may see or identify in ancient Indian times is very different from the kind of patriarchy and the forms, its manifestations that we should see, that are visible at times, but which we need to maybe examine and explore in what is a sort of globalized world. It's different. It may also be different, its manifestation may be different between, say, northern India and southern India. Even within southern India, there may be different traditions. So how that patriarchy manifests itself is reflected, be it in our language, be it in our customs, be it in so-called traditions, be it in our historical representation, art, culture, any of those forms. So there is a commonness, and yet there is a diversity. And I think when we discuss India, when we discuss women in India, these aspects have to be kept in mind continuously. Continuously, because it is not easy and it is not always scientific, even historically, in terms of a scientific observation, to generalize in a very sweeping way. So, for instance, if I were to say, oh, women in India are in a pathetic condition, there may be answers or questions to me saying, no, but that's not the case. Look, we've advanced in this direction, we've advanced there. So many people have made it to even break the glass ceiling at times. So, what I'm saying is, given the size, the diversity, the region, caste, class, ethnic, linguistic divisions, and those diversities, there are differences. And in any discussion on women, we have to keep both the context, the changing context, and the specificities related to these other forms in mind. The other thing that we have to keep in mind is also that, as I said, patriarchy is common to all, but forms of patriarchy and how they manifest themselves in different societies at different times change. But what is interesting is that even as debates, and we've had raging debates in India for the last 2 centuries, from the 19th century debates began in terms of what we initially talked of as social reform movements, all of you would have studied a basic level of history, for instance, about legislation against sati, on widow remarriage, on the whole age of consent, and then, of course, even more heated debates around women's right to vote, suffrage, various issues. But what is interesting is that when today notions of the nation, nationality, a construct of Indian womanhood is invoked, somehow it seeks to draw upon tradition, custom, history in very, very select ways. So, and this is not unusual. All of us do it. All of us do it. We do it in terms of our individual memory also, that we are selective. But the difference between that subjective experience or exercise and when that exercise becomes part of a national agenda, I think there is need for an intellectual as well as a societal engagement. Because a kind of a retrogressive assertion which is trying to cast our past in a particular way, construct the woman in that past in a particular and very, very narrow, selective way, and asserting the sanction of that tradition to say that, look, even in present day India, you have to play this role, you have to abide by those norms, you have to fit into that frame. Otherwise, there are questions being raised about, it can be anything. I mean, today you can be questioned about anything, your loyalty to the nation, your roots in your society. There are any kind of questions, and which can be raised from official platforms to the person staying next to you in your neighborhood who is today feels empowered enough to challenge you. So I think we need to be sensitive to the fact that very often in the public discourse, tradition, history, custom, practice are being invoked very, very selectively. And that is not necessarily a true representation of the past. Now, when we talk about all these notions, what has been the standpoint of the women's movement? The women's movement is also not a homogeneous, body. It's not as if all women who are activists or who are part of organizations, they all agree on everything. But I think what is important is that if I were to sum up a broad stroke characteristic of the women's movement in India, and we're talking about those who are consciously struggling for women's rights, because there is a longer history. Women's resistance in India to patriarchy has a very, very long history. You can go back to ancient times, to the time of Buddha, to all the anti-caste and reform movements, even within the bhakti traditions across different regions, there have been voices of resistance. But when I talk about the women's movement, I'm talking about the contemporary women's movement in India, which has seen organized resistance, and it, I would say, not just contemporary, historically, from the early part of the 20th century, certainly, we see women organizing for rights, women organizing for change. And I think in this long 200-year journey, not 200, say more than 100-year journey, we can see that there is a consensus document also which exists for us, which provides the peg and provides the standpoint from which rights in India are being negotiated by women, and that happens to be the Constitution of India, within in the making of which women were also a part. They were few. There were at least two from Kerala, I think, apart from the Akshayani Velardhan, I think there was one more. So that you had women who participated in those deliberations, who voiced their opinion, and only women did not speak about women's rights, or only women did not champion women's rights. Others too did, and those of us who have been in this movement would strongly disagree with any kind of an attempt to project that only women should represent women. Yes, women represent women, but I would say all the other members in parliament also should be representing women, because they stand by the constitution. The constitution is a good document which is in a sense pledging, it pledges itself to social change in India. So it's not as if women's voices for change are coming from the margins or coming from some other location. There are many who try to argue that these are all Western oriented feminists, etc. It's all bogus. It's all bogus. Why is it bogus? Because I think the Constitution of India is the most clear document on a pledge to change. And it is a pledge to change, commits itself, binds the government. It envisions a society which is premised on equality. And when I say equality, I do not mean only equality for women. Because equality for women alone is not even possible. For me, as a student of history, it is very clear that if women are to get equality, it has to be equality in all senses and for all the people of my country. It is not as if only us women can get equal. Those who are talking about women's equality specifically are in a sense talking about gender parity. And gender parity is definitely a goal. It is an objective, and it is increasingly becoming clear that in a neoliberal world, even gender parity is not possible. Gender parity also will have to be negotiated through these contestations of democracy, in a sense. I mean, if democracy is to prevail, it is only through that process that gender parity can also be achieved. I mean, what I'm saying is that women in the corporate sector should also get parity vis-a-vis this whole issue of how many women sit in the boardroom. Even that level of equality, this system is today not willing to provide. So even for that negotiation, I mean, leave alone landless, Dalit, tribals, resourceless, assetless, poor, migrants, is challenging your right to equality. It is putting that on hold at every point. And I think that is both a matter of political will. It's also a matter of the structures within which this struggle. So when we talk about women's equality and equality in principle, we are in a sense also, we have to understand that the denial of equality, the discrimination that women suffer from, the oppression that women are vulnerable to or experience, they are not just a consequence of mindsets or representation or stereotypes. These trends, these tendencies, these social practices, they have their roots in the structures of society. Why am I saying that? What I'm saying is that feudalism, for instance, had its own structures within which patriarchy was embedded and embodied. If you look at Kerala society, on the one hand, it is seen as matrilineal. At the same time, within that matrilineal also, specific forms of patriarchy were existing, and they existed to perpetuate that system. I think the whole struggle against that form of matrilineal, which is seen as a curbing of women's rights, also has to be placed in that context. When I remember when I tried to read EMS Nambudripad's work on Kerala society, I found that he was placing the discussion on women and matrilineal within the larger context of caste-based inequalities, and the feudal systems that were prevailing there. So what I'm saying is, similarly today, in present-day capitalism, present-day world economy, world capitalism, as well as the forces that you see in India, if we think that capitalism will allow for equality to women, we will be living in a sort of false utopian world of hope, which may be based on our privileges, because this system, I mean, if today working class women and the poor are particularly oppressed and targeted in very specific ways, if you think that is not part of capitalism's strategy, we will not be able to understand it, we will not also be able to fight it. So these are the broader contexts within which we have to see and understand women, develop a sensitivity in terms of how do we approach issues of women and marginalization, inequality, because women are in fact the most deprived, usually, normally, generally, within the most marginalized groups also. So on the one hand, there is that systemic exclusion and oppression. On the other hand, there is the specificity. How Dalit women face a different kind of patriarchy, and there have been discussions, for instance, on Dalit patriarchy also amongst women scholars. So those aspects also have to be kept in mind when we discuss. And this is not just India. You will find the discussions on women's social experience, life world, the social history of oppression of women goes back a long way. In modern times, if we look at the last 200, 300 centuries or so, I mean, 3 centuries since the 18th century, let us say, during the French Revolution, during the British labor movements, the Chartists, the working class movements in England, we've had, and the whole of Europe, we've had thinkers, philosophers, as well as more active practitioners raising this. I mean, you can go back to Mary Wollstonecraft, Olympe de Gouges. You can go back to the utopian socialist Fourier, and then Engels, Marx, etc. Of course. And then you had women writers, scholars. You had Simone de Beauvoir, of course. I mean, classic in a sense. But even if we look at more recent decades, or say the last 50 years, we've had very good scholars who've examined, for instance, Engels' book. Eleanor Leacock has done that, and Gerda Lerner has done it from a different standpoint. There have been scholars who have challenged stereotypes in very specific ways. And that brings me to some of the more recent empirical sort of body of scholarship that we have around women. We have that in India, we also have that from elsewhere. So if we look at it, apart from the colonial period that I was talking about, and the struggle to frame the constitution, in independent India, we've also had a continuity of the movement with some breaks and gaps. Many of the leaders were in jail. Those on the left were often underground or in jail in the post-independence period also. But say for people of my generation, the 70s, the 1970s were critical. They were critical in different ways. So for students of my generation, the sense of political, social consciousness, a sense of public consciousness, in a sense, came through the imposition of the emergency, when suddenly there was a public clamping down on rights, and done so in supposedly legitimate ways through legislative process, in a sense, executive process, not so much legislative, but in a sense implemented also through a legislative and parliamentary procedure. The emergency shaped our consciousness. It brought, um, and there were several movements prior to the emergency, during the emergency, and post-emergency. I think I remember, if I remember correctly, as a student, one of the struggles that we talked about in those days was the murder of a student in Kerala. That was one of the big struggles in the student movement. There were the movements in Gujarat, in Bihar, against corruption and various other aspects, price rise, so many, against renaming of universities, and the students were brought onto the streets through those kind of issues. But what stayed with us, in a sense, was that, I'll give it a very personal. I was associated with a sort of more left tendency, which treated parliament as, bourgeois concessions, this is bourgeois platforms, etc. But what the emergency told us how important it was to guard the parliamentary forum, to guard and sort of protect those rights and the platforms that bourgeois democracy gives us, bourgeois liberal constitutions give us. This is very important, because where do you debate? We may think more radically, but the fact is that you have to negotiate through the existing structures, and through those existing structures you can do a lot. I will talk to you about a report called Towards Equality, which was the report of a committee, what is called the Committee on the Status of Women in India, CSWI as we call it. Its report was called Towards Equality. It came out just before the emergency. Now, the notion that we all have is that all committees are government committees, and therefore they only do whitewashing of the government. Now, if you read Towards Equality, it in a sense does exactly the opposite. It gives a 25-year assessment of independent India and women's position in independent India to say, look, what is going on? Women are being increasingly more marginalized, and they did it through indicators of demography, sex ratios. Towards Equality, very few people realize, was one of the first government reports which highlighted the adverse sex ratio. Today, in subsequent years, we went more advanced into discussions of sex ratios at different age groups, so child sex ratio, or in the higher age group, etc. But the fact is that Towards Equality was the first official report, and it, as I said, so low in the economic participation. Of course, by present day standards, we may have been doing better, because Towards Equality was focusing on women in the public sector, in the organized sector, and saying, look, women are so low. Today we're not even talking about that. We're saying how many home-based, how many self-employed, how many street vendors. We're not even talking about jobs in the organized sector for women at all. And Towards Equality tried to link these different indicators. They have a huge chapter on the law, which is so detailed that even now, sometimes when I need to comment or understand certain issues, I go back to that chapter. What I'm saying is how social scientists and academics and scholars can play a role by putting things on record and not being scared enough to say what the government will do. And this report was tabled in Parliament just before the emergency. So what I'm saying is, there are histories. I don't know whether that's possible today, but it was possible in 1974-75, because the report is dated 31st December 1974, and it was placed in Parliament in 1975, just prior to the imposition of the emergency. So that was a very national context. There was, of course, an international context also, which is, of course, that we all may put on record that 1975 was declared the International Women's Year, and subsequently a decade was imposed, and subsequently different agencies at the UN, ILO, many international platforms pushed for women's rights. But I think when we talk about the report towards equality, we also need to, what I was saying prior to that, that a lot of women, a lot of political activists were drawn into this struggle for rights, for democratic rights, and that stayed, and that is from where we see a resurgence of the women's movement and discussions on women's rights post-emergency, and definitely coming to the fore in 1980s. Now, this is not something unrelated to what was going on in India. Apart from the trends, the indicators, the data which Towards Equality put out in the public domain, and this was all government data, and well-reputed scholars from educational institutions whose services, in a sense, or whose voluntary services, this committee enlisted to do studies on different aspects, and all that is given in the report. The number of scholars there. So there is a role that scholars can play. But I think the 70s was also a period when violence in India was increasing, particularly violence in rural India. And you see, today a lot of people say, oh, women's movement did not take up so-and-so segments issues. But I think in 1970s, when we were students, the real struggle was happening in rural India, especially in North India. The contradictions of the feudal society that we were trying to come out, and the new market economy, they were all playing themselves out in different ways. The Dalits, the landless, the tribals. In a sense, in independent India, 1970s was a fresh onslaught on the poor, the marginalized. And the issues of women and violence were also coming from those segments. So it is not always correct to say that the women's movement did not take up Dalit women's issues. That's not correct. Because, for instance, the whole 1980 issue of the Mathura rape case, Mathura was not only a minor, but in every memorandum or every piece of writing we put down, we said a tribal girl. So we were aware of the social denominations and the factors of exclusion and marginalization. Of course, it was a different moment in history. It was not the 90s when identities had come to the fore in a different way. So the rural conflicts that we saw in the 1970s, where women were targeted in very specific ways, and that is what brings me to the whole question of violence. Violence is not always only random. Violence, particularly in rural India in those decades, had to be understood in the context of the social conflicts and social contradictions. And it was the rural, Dalit, landless population which was the victim of extreme forms of violence. And when violence is perpetrated on women, it often comes, if not always, with the sexual violence agenda. I mean, the manifestation of violence against women is increasingly, from the 70s we can see, taking a sexual form, and that has to be addressed in different ways. And we've seen that even in 2012, Nirbhaya, or last year the Hathras rape case, etc. So what I was saying was that 1970s represented a different moment in India's history, in the world history maybe, in terms of realignments, assertions from the UN. It's also clear that at the level of the UN, the socialist countries, the socialist bloc was pushing for a focus on women. Vida Tomsic, who was Lucille Mayer, Vida Tomsic, all the people who were representing the Commission on the Status of Women at the UN were. Lucille Mayer came from a Caribbean, a black slave Caribbean background. Vida Tomsic, I have met her. She said her family, her grandmother was a serf. So, socialist society had its own aspirations and objectives, and these people were pushing for a greater recognition of women's rights in the international bodies. And I think when we look at the UN, we should not just see it as a sort of faceless entity. We should understand how different political formations assert different views, how the whole search for a new world economic order and alternatives in development, and that reflected in what we call the development debates in the 1970s and 80s, WID, WAD, GAD as we call it, women and development, and you may study about it during the course of your program. But in India, we saw some institutional responses to the kind of questions that were coming up. We were raising them as students to begin with, but there were others. There were people like Professor Veena Mazumdar, Professor Neera Desai in Bombay. They were responding. Veena Mazumdar had been the member secretary and had drafted the Towards Equality report, the bulk of it. There was Leela Dubey, who was writing on the family, Lotika Sarkar talking about the law. Some of these had been members of the committee, Sakina Hassan, Fulrenu Guha, of course, who was chair. So these people had come in contact with these issues also at the intellectual level. And subsequently, Veena Mazumdar, for instance, with huge support from J.P. Naik, who was heading the Indian Council for Social Science Research, where the first women's studies unit was set up in any government agency. It's interesting that post the submission of that committee's report, the ICSSR took this initiative. At another level, Bombay SNDT, the first women's university that India has had ever, Bombay set up what I think in 1974 or 76, they set up what was called the RCWS, the Research Center on Women's Studies. So we had these initiatives. By the 1980s, these took greater shape. The UGC responded. The UGC in the mid-80s set up women's studies centers. It also set up what we call WDCs, Women's Development Centers, in colleges and several. So like that. Now, these people were not just sort of looking for positions. Veena Mazumdar, for instance, was already in dialogue with the other scholars at the international level who were talking about how women had to be incorporated within planning, governmental policy, etc. Those initiatives were not just happening abroad, they were also happening within India. I mean, I was still very young, I remember, when Veena Mazumdar enlisted a whole lot of us and women's organizations, and we all went to the Planning Commission. M.S. Swaminathan was the vice chair at that time, and we asked, under the leadership of some of these very, very senior and experienced people, saying what does the Indian plan, 5-year plan say, and what does it promise to women in terms of the plan? And that is how you get the first chapter in the 6th plan on women. the 5-year plans never had a section on women till then. This is the first time. There was intense debate. Government servants sitting there, bureaucrats sitting there in those meetings said, how can we talk only about women? We think only about the family or the household, etc. No, there was debate. But that debate was possible. It yielded a lot of new thinking, and it was translated in terms of commitments. The first time, nowadays you hear about 33% in terms of reservation, representation. So the Planning Commission, after discussion with the women and having considered the memorandum that women gave to the Planning Commission, they introduced a formula that in all the poverty eradication and poverty alleviation programs, they would allocate 40% resources to women for schemes for women, etc. So a targeted approach of a different kind, not the targeted approach of the neoliberal policy framework, but a targeted approach was brought in. So what I'm saying is this dialogue and this sort of continuous thinking, rethinking in very contextualized sort of platforms and moments between activists, scholars, and policymakers yielded some of the results. And that is why, and these were important because they were in a sense taking forward the constitutional goal and commitment of equality. And as we all know that our constitution pledges equality, but we are constantly talking about how it has to translate in substantive equality, that juridical, legal, equality is there, but unequal circumstances prevail and inequality prevails at all levels. So those are the kind of debates we all had. Since then, of course, things moved much more forward. Towards equality, as I said, put on some issues, which then became part of discussions, the whole sex ratio issue. And I think that in the 1980s, some gains were made, both in terms of dialogue, pressure, and yet in the 80s itself, we saw that certain different kind of challenges started to come. If I look at it, for instance, the Shah-Bano issue, the Sati issue, these were in a sense identity-based mobilizations which were challenging the objectives that the women's organizations were trying to move with. And as I said, despite differences, the underlying principle of activism and the dialogue with academics, women academicians as well as others, was that the constitution provides a framework within which we can negotiate. So there was a commonality of concern even as there was a diversity of perspective. For instance, the largest women's organization, ADWA, had a very clear perspective which had been laid out in some of the political discussions when the organization was being set up, which said that unlike the autonomous groups, which at that time certainly talked only of a gender identity, the autonomous groups have also moved from their position in the 70s to their position taken around Beijing and mid-90s because of these experiences. But organizations like ADWA, for instance, they were very clear from the start that the way we see gender oppression is women's oppression is at 3 levels: in terms of citizenship, in terms of democracy, so both in terms of the domains of the state, citizenship, in terms of your experience of oppression coming from a social class, which is an exploited class, and of course a commonality of concern in terms of vulnerability of gender. So while all women are vulnerable to oppression and experience different forms of oppression in the socio-cultural domain, etc. But women from oppressed and exploited social groups, classes, experience it in a particular way. And thirdly, that in terms of the domain of citizenship, be it caste, be it ethnicity, be it region, you may be denied your share of equality or your right to equality on those counts. So a three-pronged approach to addressing women's oppression was part of the formation of the perspective of organizations on the left and mass-based organizations. So these debates happen. I think the anti-dowry movement was one of the most successful movements at that time, and yet, as you can see, and you can see sitting in Kerala also, where we've had recent history of dowry cases coming up. And I'll come to those aspects. What context may have framed my ideas and my engagement with the social order in the 1970s is vastly different today, 50 years later. It is vastly different both in terms of the political formation, it is vastly different in terms of the economy. And I mean, post 2020, we cannot even talk only in terms of the economy, we have to talk in terms of the post pandemic or ongoing pandemic. Now, what are the issues that we find more recently? The sex ratio issue remains, and I think the 2021 census, if it can be out with its results at some point, may show even more alarming trends in sex ratios. From 2011 onwards, we have seen the Northeast, which had very favorable ratios, has also shown signs, for instance, in Nagaland, etc., of some kind of adversity entering the child sex ratios. Kerala, I remember the mid-90s. I remember being a speaker in the valedictory session and in the sessions on this international conference on women in Kerala in 1995, I think, if I remember correctly. And at that time, Professor Veena Mazumdar raised the issue of sample registration survey data, which had begun to point to the possibilities of sex selective practices coming into Kerala. Now, North is known for it. I mean, Punjab, Haryana, Delhi, Rajasthan, UP, we are known for our anti-girl child practices. Okay, and these have become, in a sense, universalized. And this is the point I was trying to make. I was born in a small town, which is known in British India as having the highest record of female infanticide. But my mother was the sole surviving child, and when I asked her, she said, oh, but the Brahmins did not practice it, other castes practiced it. So what I'm saying is we should also not universalize these practices in our mind. Because now what is happening is it only anti-women practices from, so all communities are embracing anti-women practices of other communities, be it Hindu, Muslim, Christian, or be it caste. So practices which were not part of your history are also now being taken in, so long as they are anti-women. So that selective process of anti-women practices is becoming a universal practice and phenomena now, and we also then begin to cite it as our history. But that difference, divergence and diversity of customary practices is also being erased in the process. So from 1990s, if we see, particularly since neoliberal policies, the whole perspective of what we call liberalization, privatization, global LPG phenomena. Now, this is not about upholding state sector or public sector. I think those debates can continue. Different people may have different. But what does the data tell us? The data tells us huge agrarian crisis, huge, persistent agrarian crisis, low investment, stagnation by the state in the agrarian economy, which was your big sector. How does that reflect on women's status? Now, if you see of course, child sex ratios have worsened, means I think 2021, I don't know where we will be. I mean, it may be totally alarming. And I was beginning to talk about Kerala, and I can, you may be familiar with it, but 2011 sex ratios for Thrissur, for Chavakar, etc., are a matter of concern. And you know why I have this hesitation about attributing it to poverty alone? Because in the north, certainly we have seen it is the richer sections which practice more pre-birth elimination and sex selective practices. Richer communities, castes also, they practice these more. They also have the money, they have better access to technology. And now it is not just elimination of the fetus, now it is pre-birth selection. So, you know, if you go for assisted reproductive technologies, you choose the sex of the baby, they choose the gender in a sense, and nobody in India wants to have a girl child. If they're spending, say, 3 to 5 lakhs to have a baby, the choice is not of a girl child. So how, and that is important for an institution located in the science, because you know science and scientists, when we started out, they used to say, but science is objective, economists that economics is objective, the market is objective, the market impacts all. But we all see how the market impacts all, but it impacts all unequally, because if I'm unequally socially located, economically located, when I'm entering the market, its impact is different. During the pandemic, we have seen that pandemic has affected everyone, but the poor, the migrants, the daily wagers, the street vendors, they are affected in more unequal ways, and women are affected in more unequal ways. And this has been a huge tremor. Even the big lords have been shaken, except the favored or twosome. Everyone else has been affected in the economy. So that is one. Work has been affected, very poor. So agrarian was affected, and since women, till the 2011 census, a higher proportion of women were located in the agrarian rural economy. That is where they have been displaced from. And when I was saying that, you know, this tendency to think that our discipline, we are objective, we are not gender. I mean, the economists, for more than 20 years, the data was telling you that women's migration was increasing. It's increasing, increasing, increasing. The most phenomenal increase in migration has been of women. But no economist till at least I think 2005 to 10 was willing to talk about it. Why? Because there is a dictum that all married women are migrants, because all married women, mostly in North India particularly, most married women marry out of their village. You know, there is caste endogamy, but there is village exogamy, as we understand it in sociology. So what happens? Almost all married women are registered and migrants, and therefore no social scientist wants to look at it, because, this is all marriage related, it's not happening because of the economy. But if the agrarian economy is being devastated, if you're not going to look at how it's impacting the different sections of society within that, you're not even going to probe or analyze women's migration. So our team of scholars at the center where I was located, when we undertook this gender and migration study, it's up on the net, it's published in different places, you can see that we were continuously trying to say, look at gender, look at women. And we were saying that still during the pandemic. Even during the pandemic, I looked at just about every circular that Government of India issued from the center. Till I think 2 months, 3 months later, they were still not even registering that women are also amongst migrants. Of course, there were fewer, I mean, even the visuals that you saw, women were fewer, but they were there. Now, you don't look at it. Now, if you don't look at it in terms of declining work participation, they kept saying, no, no, no. There's a debate. There is a debate. Even amongst women economists also today, there is a debate. But from, say, the last 10 to 15 years, our NSSO and census data has been showing a decline in women's work participation. Now, there are different levels and ways of looking at it. First level that women's studies showed was non-recognition, invisibility of women's work, and this whole middle class perception that women do not work. And now women are beginning to work. You know, these educated women, middle class women think we are the first to go out of our families to work. But in rural India, if you think the women were not part of the village economy or the farm economy, even you're sadly mistaken. And Esther Bostrup, for instance, showed it in the 70s, her whole work on economic role of women in development. And Veena Mazumdar, having looked at a large part of India, both as part of her Towards Equality report, as well as subsequently her engagement, she specifically always talked about women and agriculture. Now, firstly you have to recognize it. You have to recognize and make it visible. You have to start recording it, and therefore we had discussions with the national statistical agencies, the census, to discuss all of these issues. And these are academic interventions. That is why these dialogues are necessary, cross dialogue, cross communities in terms of professionals, activists, social scientists, bringing their experiences to government agencies, saying, please understand what we're talking about, which has led, for instance, to the time use study, which was done in 1997-98. Now, this is how sensitivity to the pressures coming from below works. But if you want to, if the discourse is of denial, that nothing wrong is happening, everything is fine, these adverse are all oppositional voices, they are politically motivated, then the change will not happen, because you will not listen, you will not critique, you will not engage, you will not dialogue, and that dialogue will not show in response. And those are the issues. So we've seen it in work, we've seen it in terms of health issues, we've seen it, of course, most blatantly on crime and violence. Now, when women find work, what is the work they find? All studies show they are concentrated in the lowest segments of the economy, most ill-paid, most insecure work conditions, and also, ironically, well, I should not be saying ironically, but say 40 years ago, even my generation thought when people move to urban India, then caste sort of disappears, caste stays in the village. It doesn't happen. What is happening is women from the oppressed castes in villages, when they move to the cities, here also they swell the numbers of those castes, and they are then concentrated in the menial jobs. So caste is not disappearing, it's taking a new form, it's taking a new shape of discrimination within this now ever expanding urban economy. And in that location, there are different forms of vulnerabilities, but again, these are higher vulnerabilities for those who are coming from the oppressed marginal groups. And same thing is happening with tribes. What is happening is when there is a sort of total taking away of the common property resources, the forest, ecological issues, and Kerala has seen some of those also. But Jharkhand, Orissa, the whole central Indian belt of tribals, their resources, and in the name of development, they've been divested of their access to forests, which were a form of livelihood for them. So if they lose their livelihood, how do they survive? Now, and these are poor estimations, but the estimations are that from Jharkhand alone, there are maybe 5 to 7 lakh women in Delhi alone as domestic workers. Now, on the one hand, they're finding a kind of a job. It is again a stereotyped role of domestic worker. You're doing this work. It's one of the less paid, unorganized. Domestic workers by and large remain unorganized where efforts have happened. Even during the pandemic, it was shown that they were not beneficiaries of any kind of relief, even amongst construction workers. So, and they are specifically vulnerable. The center where I was, CWDS, did specific studies and sexual harassment, etc. These are, I mean, you know, the levels of vulnerability go up as you chart unknown terrain in new cities, big urban. So you go to Bombay or Delhi, I mean, you don't have support mechanisms, and women are extremely vulnerable. So one is the random violence that women face on the streets. Now, this was not even recorded, and I'm not sure how it's being recorded now, because between the 90s, we got it through the National Crime Records Bureau, dowry murders, dowry deaths, dowry, etc. But in 2016, the NCRB discontinued their earlier series in the name of reorganization. After that, what they have come out with, I'm a bit worried. So what I'm saying is, A, there is gender blindness. That gender blindness and invisibility translates in the data, and there has to be a continuous engagement. And it is only when you engage, then you can address it. And that is why women's studies is important, because that has to be studied in specificity. Kerala's the experience of education, women's education, and then subsequent to that, the unemployment amongst this educated section of women. You must understand, Kerala has one of the highest rates of that problem. Or, for instance, an adverse sex ratio, in which Kerala has seen the first. Kerala has seen the first transition to what we call the reverse pyramid, which is a higher section of women in the senior age group. Now, these are different sets of problems. So how you address child sex ratios being adverse is different from how you address the problems of the supposedly positive sex ratio in the higher age group. But what are the needs? What are the specific policy measures required? Those are issues. When you have, I mean, I'm not for stalling development in the name of holding on to tradition, but I think all development has to be assessed in terms of the impact on communities, and safeguards have to be provided, including for ecology, of course. And I think Kerala has faced one of the worst flood disasters in recent years, so that has to be kept in mind. I think Kerala has some specific, but before I move to Kerala, let me just say 2-3 points which are general. You know, national policies leave a lot to be questioned, and a lot of engagement is required. But what we find is you make certain beginnings, and then it's like 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Sometimes it can be 2 steps back and only 1 step forward. The new education policy needs to be studied very carefully. I have to say I haven't done that too carefully. But the 1986 policy had a chapter, and that chapter gave the report that title. The women's education chapter was called Education for Equality. And that gave the 1986 policy, Education for Equality. That it talked about women's studies, it talked about gender sensitivity. I am not sure what are the commitments that the new education policy that was introduced last year does. Another point that I would like to talk about is this whole thing of objectivity in terms of science, because technology is seen as a big leveler. But we have seen both during the pandemic, but the women's movement has seen it much, much before the pandemic. Technology can also be the biggest game changer to reverse attempts at equality. I think today's paper's report on the education, the rural-urban divide, which is very sharp, and also the gender divide, that is very clear. But women have been seeing how assisted reproductive technologies, surrogacy, how these, Guy Standing, for instance, one of the scholars on globalization, argued that globalization brings feminization of labor. Now, feminization of labor is not happening in the organized sector. Feminization is not happening in the highly paid sectors. Where is feminization happening? It is happening in the most vulnerable, poorest sections. And the strangest ways that we have seen is, for instance, poor women going in for surrogacy, in a sense, to give out their womb to find sustenance for their families for 6 months, 1 year maybe. And there were arguments saying, no, these are not poor women. The multi-billionaire industry that was thriving in Gujarat, at one point I called it the Gujarat model of development, very different from the Kerala model of development, because it was thriving on surrogacy. And what was surrogacy? They said, no, it's not poor women. Then studies by Amrita Pandey and some of the journalists showed how it was. I mean, the maximum monthly earning of some of those families was 8,000 at that time. Now, if they were not poor, they were rickshaw pullers. What were they? I have met women in Delhi who don't even sometimes tell their husbands, but to pay for their school fees for their children, etc., they go for egg donation. And we don't know what pandemic is doing. Pandemic would have done far worse things because it's not going to come out for a long, long time. But we've already seen today's headlines which say how women's work burdens have increased in the family economy, in the rural sector, for instance, and it's all in the unpaid sector. So how crisis brings newer burdens. My point is, unless you study, and you study each situation differently from a different sensitivity, because you cannot generalize. I cannot generalize about the pandemic from my location of the 70s. It doesn't work. So that has to, and there has to be a conceptual engagement also, and there has been. Women's studies has produced a lot in terms of standpoint theory, feminist theory, of course, which is debatable. There can be different positions on the moral framework in terms of socialization, both from Indian locations and in foreign locations. We have enough. On crime and violence, if nothing, you have the Verma Committee report, but of course you have several. There's the SEC data, which also brings out some of these issues, so those are there. What I have always maintained, I mean, in this course you will be exposed to different people. Some will assert a feminist methodology. In my own work, I have always argued that I do not approach my academic work with a feminist research methodology, because I do not believe there can be a single feminist research methodology. We come from different disciplines, from different disciplinary trainings. Secondly, feminism alone is not sufficient to understand the diverse reality, social complexity of Indian society, and no one. So I believe in what I call research methodology and methodological perspectives from a women's studies location. Coming to Kerala, I'll just talk of a few things. I think you have tremendous openings. When you have, the biggest stumbling block the women's movement has seen in the last 40, 50 years, what I have been a part of, is the total lack of political will. Now, I think by and large, the left governments have shown a greater commitment. You have to hold them up to account for it, of course, at each step, because they can also fumble. That they don't is a big relief. That they show a commitment is important. But I think on all these issues of work, health indicators, Kerala has had a different debate on not mortality but morbidity, those issues. when your economy works on migration, migrants, particularly to the Gulf, there have been studies showing how those who returned from the Gulf brought in slightly more retrogressive fundamentalist perspectives. I myself have seen the change, say, from the Shahabanu times when one saw Kerala society, Malappuram, how the fundamentalism we are seeing is an assertion of the majority community. It may pass itself off as nationalism, but that is what we are seeing. And I think we need to be sensitive to these changes, what they breed in others. I think we need much more debate, discussion, and actual monitoring of the scene on crime, violence, including domestic violence, sexual violence, as well as domestic violence. There's been a sort of denial, Kerala being a more advanced, matrilineal, history is different, women have a better status. I mean, we in the north were always told when we were growing up, Kerala is different, their women are more advanced. But unfortunately, the history on violence, crime has not been such a good record, and I think we need to question much more. We need to discuss much more. I think from the state, good initiatives have been taken, even in terms of wind up. I should. Yeah. So what I'm saying is these are the broader frameworks. I think the Kutumbashri experiment, now I can't even call it an experiment, the experience, including giving out land on lease for agriculture, the whole Kutumbashri experience during the migrants crisis would have been interesting. The people's planning process has thrown up many challenges. It has been taken forward. In the 90s, we were talking more on the challenges. But, we must understand that ruling ideologies don't give up so soon. You have to keep at it. They sort of reorganize, they reconfigure, they come back. So the struggle for social change has to be a continuous process. I think the best part of the discussion in Kerala has been the openness, and I think we need much more openness, much more. I mean, you have to critique and continuously engage with a kind of conservatism, especially the kind of a moral frame within which women are sought to be put. You need to discuss. I mean, where is society putting the women? Where is it taking them? This is a world post-pandemic where trafficking would have increased considerably. Maybe sex work, so-called prostitution, would have increased, because if work is going down, livelihood is threatened, where do the women go to feed their families? And women have to feed the families. That's the broad stereotype within which you work. The PLFS data on work is out today also, but my colleagues Indrani Mazumdar and Neeta have been writing about it for the last 10 years. I think you all should look at it, including from the context of Kerala. I think one important aspect is, of course, migrants. There's no time. I'm not going to talk about it now. But government sector, not Kerala, but at the central level, women in Anganwadis, Ashas, they are not recognized as workers. They're not entitled to minimum wages. They are categorized as helpers. I remember you had a parliamentarian, Sati, yeah? She was speaking at a convention of trade union active for the so-called volunteer scheme workers. She listed out some, I think, 11 categories: Shiksha Mitra, Narega, Sarv Shiksha Abhiyan, Asha, Anganwadi, some 11 categories. Then the self-help groups, etc. Who were none of them, and this is more than, I think, nearly 2 crores of women workers who are not recognized as workers by the state. It's the government of India which provides the legal framework within which their work is seen as help, volunteerism. So they're all volunteers, helpers, and they're given such names, Sakhi, Mitra, all that, but they are denied their minimum rights as workers. Of course, now you have new codes, labor codes, brought in this special session of parliament we had, where the farmers' bills were also passed, and you can see. So what I'm saying is, women have to be. I mean, if agrarian economy is in a crisis, gender relations are bound to be in a crisis. So we need both. We need the broader context, we need the specificity to understand, for instance, how science works to reconfigure patriarchy, how economic trends reconfigure and strengthen and perpetuate patriarchy. But above all, I think the biggest issue that we have today is that our democracy should remain vibrant. It should give women and men and all women and all men from all different segments of class, caste, community, regions, the space to discuss their rights, to enjoy their rights, to uh, develop and assert a more meaningful way of engaging in the public space with those rights. And I think that needs to be addressed above all. You're in a slightly better position than I am, sitting in the national capital. I hope you had better chances to discuss. And as I said, allow for contesting, interrogating different perspectives and frameworks, because all of us have to learn. None of us have the answers. India is too much of a cauldron and a complex society. None of us, we may think we have the answers, or we may have our orientation that this is the way we would like to think. But I think we all need to think, discuss, debate, and arrive at a civilized forms of confronting retrogressive ideologies, retrogressive practices. But definitely, if India is to move forward, it has to engage with that process, and that is what brings vibrance to our democracy. So that is our hope, and you are our hope. I mean, this generation, I can tell you, in my age, all I can say is I live on hope that you all will take this struggle forward. Thank you. I think I've taken a lot of time, so please, thank you.
Thank you, madam.
Yeah.
Thank you, madam,
Okay.
for that insightful lecture. Especially for taking us along an extremely comprehensive journey of women's movement in India, which you were also a part of, and also for reminding us in such times where there is a sort of jading and calcification of ideas and knowledge spaces, for reminding us of an alternative inheritance that we possess, an alternative inheritance of dissent. It's not audible, ma'am.
Sorry, the audio's gone from your side. I don't know if you can hear me, but I can't hear you suddenly.
Am I audible right now?
Yes, now you are. Yeah. No, no. Yeah.
I was thanking you for taking us
Yeah.
along journey. Because let's face it, that we are living in a moment of extreme intolerance to ideas, but you have reminded us of an alternative inheritance that we have of dissenting women, courageous women, of research which has been done even in dire circumstances. I hope that all the participants of this FDP will take this forward, especially the idea of celebrating modernity of ideas, but also sort of taking the veil away in certain ways, making women's work, women's labor visible, and also constant interrogation. I now open the floor for further discussion. You can either put your comments in the chat box and we'll take it as questions, or alternatively, you can unmute yourself and ask your questions to Professor Indu Agnihotri. I urge you to take this opportunity.
I think they're exhausted. If they're hesitant, what I would say is you have an excellent panel of speakers in your program, and they should maybe, they'll get an opportunity to clarify many of these issues in those sessions also. They're, of course, welcome to speak now, but I mean, I'm hopeful and confident that your panel of speakers will address many of these issues and from maybe different standpoints.
Thank you, ma'am. If the other participants don't have a question, I would like to end the session by asking you specifically. We are in a University of Science and Technology. Like you mentioned before, there is always a bias of objectivity that comes with the discipline. But as a women's studies center, which is located in such a space where you are urged to keep your identities outside the classroom, what will be the one suggestion or advice that you would give us from which we can move forward?
You see, one section which I had planned to take up but I couldn't was, there are certain myths and assumptions. There are premises. Our disciplines inherit those premises, and they think these are the golden rules of our discipline, and that they signify this objectivity. Very often, for instance, I mean, if you read Simone de Beauvoir, what is she saying? She's saying in 1940s there was all this belief that women's brains were smaller. Now those ideas keep coming back. These same ideas keep coming back, and they're repeated in scientific journals across the international sort of scale. Now, a lot of these premises become myths, and they are sort of embedded within our disciplinary trainings. So firstly, you have to open out all the windows and say, look, for heaven's sake, we stop all that. Science particularly. Firstly, also push a scientific temper. Reach out to the people. I mean, you are living in a state. I mean, I say we live in a country, but you're living in a state. I mean, I'll give you an example. I was in Kerala, I think in 2015 for about 3 weeks. And I was admitted to an Ayurvedic hospital. And you know what the Ayurvedic doctor told me? The Ayurvedic doctor told me that when your temple festivals are on, and the biggest festival, which became the big issue in Kerala, men are not supposed to eat food cooked by women who are polluted. Okay? Now, what is the notion of pollution? I'm not spelling it out. You know it. So, women come to her, and this was a doctor telling me, women come to her to reschedule their menstrual cycles so that these men do not go to other women for cooking their food, which may be a prelude to other forms of relationships. I mean, nothing was said, and I'm not talking from empirical evidence, but this was a doctor who told me that women are worried because according to the norms of pollution, those who are undergoing their menstrual cycle are not supposed to be cooking for those who are undertaking those pilgrimages or those darshans in those temples. Now, I mean, my point is, to what extent? So firstly, improve the scientific temper. We live in a country where those who are propagating rationality are murdered. So, I mean, in Kerala, the violations in the superstitious norms or so-called norms in the name of custom are maybe not so obvious, not so blatant. In other parts, they're much more blatant, whether it's witch hunting to whatever. So, firstly, promote scientific temper. Secondly, question, interrogate the premises and the myths which come as assumptions, premises for your disciplinary foundations. Thirdly, see what is the impact of the science and technology that is coming in. I'd recommend a book to you, but there are others. Jyotsna Gupta's book on assisted reproductive technologies and her writings on genetics and how genetics is being used to advance these kind of anti-women patriarchal practices through the market. So what I'm saying is there are any number. I'm not so familiar with the discipline of science, but I'm aware that today scientists have been organizing and they've been doing it for 25 years. For instance, the Krishi Vigyan Kendras, the IARI, the research institutes, the more natural physical science institutions, you need to do a thorough fact check. Firstly do a thorough fact check. Where are the women located? How high do they go? What are the blocks? Because there are certain subjective blocks, but there are certain institutional blockages which exist, and both in terms of gender parity, because I think physical presence of women in these higher bodies is an issue of gender parity. But that gender parity is also a victim of the kind of larger prejudices that prevail. I mean, the whole manner in which, how come science is being advanced to promote surrogacy, and the agencies which are practicing surrogacy are saying, hum to charity kar rahe. When we question them in a TV program, this lady who was running one of the most flourishing clinics for surrogacy in Gujarat, she said, we are doing charity. We are providing children to those who cannot have their own child. Now, what is this notion of own child? What is this notion of own child? This biology, because ultimately all these ideologies go back to who is a genetic Indian and who's an invader, who's a foreigner. I mean, all these ideologies are linked. So my own child, and an own child, which scientifically, if we look at it, will have a set of 5 parents, because some sperm donor, the woman donor, the womb, all can be different, and the adopting parents can be different. But this notion of own child, we can't go for adoption because adoption is so difficult. But genetics and genetics in India has been one of the chief sort of engineers of these kind of notions. I think we need to question. I'm not from that discipline, so I cannot. But there is sufficient work now in science journals, and scientists have been working, as well as social anthropologists who have entered into those domains. And there's a lot which you need to look at. This so-called, because this is what social science was also saying, we are objective. But on migration I can show you, on work I can show you, we can argue to no end. On history, for instance, we said there are no sources, but you go to the sources, you try to read the source, then you will find the evidence. So I think that pressure has to be kept up. Above all, that pressure and continuous interrogation in favor of science, scientific approach. Yeah?
Sound advice, the pointers, the readings that you suggested. If the other participants don't have any more questions, I will officially thank you again. We look forward to a creative association with you in the future as well. We look forward to having you again, hopefully after the pandemic, physically to discuss endoracilism. And for the rest of the participants, let me remind you that there is a feedback form in the chat box. Please kindly submit it. Attendance will be marked accordingly. We will reconvene tomorrow at 1:50 p.m. here. Thank you.
Thank you very much for providing me with this opportunity. I hope it serves some purpose. Thank you.
It was insightful, Dr. Indu. In fact, I saw one participant had unmuted herself. Najla, was it a mistake or was it to ask something?
Oh, ma'am. Hello, ma'am.
Yes.
Thank you for your informative presentation. I have one question. What is your opinion regarding the abolition of matrilineal system in Kerala and shifted to a uniform system? What is your opinion regarding this matrilineality in Kerala?
Look, my opinion doesn't matter. It happened. I mean, as my senior Dr. Sharda Mani wrote many years ago, and she pronounced it to me very directly. She said, it's dead, it's gone. I mean, way back in the 70s, I think she told me that when I was still away. Her daughter Arunima has worked, Sri Lekha Nair, and I mean, there are any number of people who've worked on it. But I think I can't say I have studied it sufficiently to have my opinion on it. I think matrilineal, firstly, to me as a student of history, it is very interesting. It offers an interesting insight into different kinds of practices, both in terms of marriage, family, inheritance, property rights, etc. So it remains a subject of great interest, although I have not had the time to study it more specifically. I do feel that to celebrate it only in terms of freedom and autonomy for the woman, without locating it in the larger context. I mean, as an outsider to that society who doesn't know sufficiently, I have to say, I've read Arunima's book, I've read my colleague Sri Lekha Nair, I've heard her papers, I've read some other work, and I mentioned, I mean, now I'm forgetting because I read some of this over 30-40 years, I don't even remember but I think we have to understand the system as it operated within the system of the existing feudal forms of property and ownership, as well as management of property, with the male occupying a specific authority and a role. Despite a lot of openness to the woman in terms of, as I said, freedom and autonomy, in terms of maybe partnership, formation of partnerships. But the sense I get when I try to read other views is that, in a sense, this was serving the purpose of the feudal system. And it was caught within not just the feudal system in terms of land and property, but also in terms of caste relations. So the caste hierarchies vis-a-vis the Nambudris and the Brahmins and the Nayars, etc. Now, I don't know enough about the caste system in Kerala. But to me, I think the shift from matrilineal happens in different stages. One is how the British saw it and how they intervened, because these interventions started late 19th century and early 20th century when the law is passed. That is the sort of final blow, and then the practice starts to die out post the legal reform as it is seen. But the question that I don't think I have a sufficient answer to, and maybe not to your question, is the complexity of that intersection of caste, state in terms of the system of property management, feudalism, agrarian relations, and freedom and autonomy for the women. That intersection was a very complex, and I think there are novels also about it. I mean, I myself have, what is it called? Kuriyata? I'm forgetting the title. It's an English translation of a Malayalam novel. It's very small. Huh?
The name is Kuriyata Tatri.
Yes, I read the English version of it. I mean, it is a deep, dark dungeon, literally. That book, if you read it, it may be exaggerated, it may be fiction, although I think it is written as some kind of an autobiographical experience. So, I'm totally steeped in North Indian social, cultural knowledge. Kerala is quite unfamiliar as far as these complexities are concerned. Even as a historian, I've tried to understand it. So I think we need to be sensitive to all those factors. Of course, it is true that with the decline of matrilineal and its end, whatever little freedom and autonomy women had has in a sense disappeared. And I have to say that on my visits to Kerala earlier, particularly long ago, now I've seen a shift over the last 10 years or so. I've seen something. I found a kind of a kind of strengthening of retrograde, a moral framework, I mean, and it's sort of the discourse was oppressive in terms of a conservative thrust. And I think student organizations need to discuss it. And if you're not sensitive, then what happens? For instance, I mean, when we did our field work, we found a lot of depression amongst women who were left alone with husbands away for long years into the Gulf. Sometimes not enough discussion happening. Or for instance, in Malappuram and some of those places, you've had those discussions. The Women's Commission took up, what was it called, Mysore Kalyanam, Arab Kalyanam, and one other. There were three things. I think when Zainaba was one of the members of the State Women's Commission, the State Women's Commission of Kerala undertook that study. Now, so these are complexities, complexities that when the social structure, when the economic structure undergoes change, what happens? As I said, at the time of Shah Banu judgment, there was a lot of organized activity by women. The kind of organized activity we saw in Kerala, in Malappuram district, I'm saying. I have photographs in the organization office, we had photographs. Now, even the kind of head covering that we saw, and so many came to Delhi, I remember, in April 1986, there were at least 100 women who came all the way from Malappuram to protest against Rajiv Gandhi's bill on, so-called protection of Muslim women's rights in 1986. The kind of head covering they were wearing was different from the North Indian burqa. But on my subsequent visits to Calicut particularly, and in the kind of burqa I have seen now, this is coming from where? It's changed in Delhi also. In Delhi also it has changed. My point is, sometimes in the name of moving forward, we move. Now, has caste practices gone out in Kerala? I want to know. You all need to ask yourself. I mean, because what I'm saying is we also stereotype. So we will stereotype the Muslim community as being retrogressive. But have caste practices gone out? No, the entire politics of Kerala is steeped in some of that caste politics till today. I mean, it may be from different standpoints. The left may be negotiating it from a different standpoint, and caste politics is also linked to social structure, land, economy, various things. But my point is, those are the negotiations. When we say gender sensitive, we are not saying, no, think only of the women. We saying, through all these changes, think of the women. Whatever changes are happening, they are impacting women. They are impacting different genders differently. And I think on some issues of gender, Kerala state policies have been slightly more advanced in terms of transgenders, etc. And what I'm saying is, there has to be an openness of discussion. For instance, on love jihad, so-called love jihad, honor crime. We thought honor crime happens only amongst the Jats in Haryana. The fact is, it happens all over the country. The fact is, choice marriage is looked down upon in all communities and is increasingly looked down upon further. On top of that, you have a majoritarian perspective which is saying interfaith marriage we will not allow because this is conversion in the name of marriage, and now they have brought laws on love jihad. So my point is, the discourse on modernity is being skewed and taken because of the political context. It is not allowing for an open debate. It's not allowing for an open debate with, and where are the youth? Where are the youth, I want to know? in this whole debate on drug jihad and so-called forced conversions, on choice marriage, on a crime? Where are the youth? Because they are the ones who are most vulnerable. Now you have to confront it. You have to confront it at the realm of ideology, you have to confront it at the realm of law, you have to confront it at the level of society and custom. And false narratives. I mean, I've studied Punjab, colonial Punjab. My doctoral research is on colonial Punjab. And the false narrative that is being put forward on the Khap Panchayats, it's a disaster. It's a sure disaster, and it is a recipe for denial of autonomy and choice to young women particularly, but to the youth. Men and women, because after all relationships involve men and women, unless they're cis or transgenders or whatever. So that's the point. Now, finally we have to come back to the thing that you have to have a democratic debate. It's not my opinion or your opinion. It has to be a democratic debate, and everyone has the freedom to express their opinion and assert their democratic choice and right. So ultimately, I will not have it. I think the debate on matrimony, what I want to know is, has there been a sufficient debate in Kerala on matrimony and the sort of undermining of that? Has there been a sufficient debate? What has that concluded? What are the aspects they have thrown out? That, because we learn from them. Just as, I mean, I can't say even I know the customs of the region that I come from sufficiently, because even there are diverse customs. But I cannot pontificate on Kerala at all. I would not even try to. What I want to know is, in fact, has there been a good debate, and have those points? Now, what I'm saying is, a feminist perspective, is it a feminist perspective alone or a historical perspective? To me, it has to be a historical perspective, because I will not judge a system based only on this one scale, which is, did women have freedom of choice in terms of partnerships? That is one aspect of the scale. But if that freedom of choice is coming at a great cost in terms of other aspects of rights, legality, and legality of all the women involved, okay, all the women involved, different sort of sections and segments and layers, as well as in terms of the increasingly more justiciable domain. It is a justiciable domain increasingly. As the British open up the land market, your land rights are also justiciable. If marriage is to be recognized, and marriage brings you rights, including in suffrage. I mean, remember, the first right to vote started saying wifehood and property. Now, if wifehood and property are to be the entry points for your legislative rights, you have to be clear on those aspects within the social domain. And I think what I'm saying is that the end of 19th century, 20th century, you were having these new complexities enter the socio-political domain. And for me, sitting here, it is difficult to decide that question which you are asking me without sufficient knowledge, because I have to look at that entirety, which is the statement I made to begin with, that women do not live in an isolated planet. They are part of this society. Your economy, your law, your politics, everything impacts my life in different ways. It may be for the positive, it may be for the negative, and different women are impacted differently. So the first wife may be impacted differently, the second wife may be impacted differently. If monogamy exists, the Nair woman may be impacted differently, the Nambudri woman may be impacted differently. So we have to have that openness of debate and evidence. I'm sorry, but I have not read in great detail, so I can't answer that question any better than this. Yeah.
Yes, excuse me, organizers. I'm Pragna. May I be allowed to speak for 1 or 2 minutes?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you, Dr. Indu, for your insightful keynote address. Thanks a lot. Please, I'm sorry, due to my feeble network, I'm not able to turn on my video. As Dr. Indu is talking about the failure of Kap Panchayats, I just would like to, add a point that, as we know that in Indian society, women are not a homogeneous group. They're divided on the lines of caste, and thus we have multiple or layered identities, derived from social relations within unequal, patriarchal, sexist, exclusionist caste system. So this is what happens when there are atrocities on women or anything, any heinous crimes committed against women. We always see in Indian society that caste and gender, they get fused. This is another important point that we should understand. And perhaps Dr. Ambedkar was the first social scientist who, in the year 1916, Columbia University, in a paper that he presented there, he talked about the relation between perpetuation of caste and women's oppression or suppression in India. Thank you.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up. I thought I tried to raise the issue of caste throughout my presentation, but obviously it is never sufficient. Because as I said, one of the things that we are still trying to confront in India is in modern India, how caste survives in this. So caste is both a matter of identity to me. It is also a matter of structural inequalities which persist. In rural India, how you fight caste in the university domain in terms of discriminatory practices and exclusions and upper caste sort of prejudices which are aggressively asserted from what one hears regularly, and Hyderabad University incident was clear, but you're getting, as a teacher, I find it very, very alarming. But I do feel that the structural embeddedness of caste has also to be addressed if we have to move forward in terms of a lasting social change. And affirmative policies as well as specific measures at every point, rather than just treating it in terms of the electoral politics. And I think there can be no question about Ambedkar's contribution to putting that issue on the sort of political agenda. There's no second opinion on that. And not just, Ambedkar of course didn't just put caste on the agenda, he put the constitution and constitutional rights on the agenda for all of us, on women's rights particularly. So the point you're making, both in terms of Ambedkar's contribution, the issue of caste, and also the what is in current parlance called intersectionality of caste, gender, I see it as caste, class, gender, tribe, etc. So the intersectionality of the marginalized communities and the experiences of oppression, for me, that has been part of the understanding of my entry in the women's movement. And that is why I talked about the perspective with which women's organizations approached the issue of women. For us, for many of us of my generation, gender was not the only index or indices on which we were examining oppression or understanding oppression or analyzing it. We were seeing gender as one of the key aspects and key axis on which discrimination was happening and inequality was being perpetuated. But we saw it along with other aspects of citizenship and denial of equal citizenship, denial of equal access of opportunity, and a systemic, structured sort of relation embedded within the economy and production and political structures which were excluding equal access, equal rights, and equal opportunities, and also justifying the vulnerabilities and the oppressions. So, for me, I mean, I can't say we did it sufficiently because the movement has never been able to do. The level of inequality that exists in our society is so huge. But was it within our perspective? From my location, I would say it was very much within our perspective. We may not have addressed it. Or also the question of caste, the way it came up in the 1970s is very different from how it has come up since the 90s. And I think it has to be responded to and addressed in that context. Because today the dynamics that is operating in terms of Indian society vis-a-vis caste is very different. Also caste is very, very diverse also. I mean, the way caste and caste exclusion is practiced in different parts of South India and the way it is practiced in different parts of North India is different. The domination of the Brahmins, how it is asserted, institutionalized and rationalized also and embedded within the political system may be different from, say, Haryana or Punjab, where Brahmins neither held a land, because it also relates to your command and control over resources. The Brahmins in UP had a lot of land, and then they were displaced by the British when Awadh was annexed by the British. A lot of the Brahmins were displaced and were reduced to poverty. In Western UP, for instance, the Brahmins occupy a different social position as compared to Eastern UP. In Punjab and Haryana, they are not the landowners. The dominant castes are the Jats, who have a history of transition from tribe to caste. So the kinship practices, everything is different. But increasingly, we are moving towards more homogenized notions of customary practice, and also there is no doubt that the ideological force that the British gave in the jurisprudence to the Brahmanical ideology and norm, especially for women, that has given it a different level. We need to be sensitive to these changes. Caste has a long history in India. I mean, it exists ever since historical time. For, say, 6th century BC, as a student of ancient history, I see Buddhism emerging and Jainism. And the kernel of Buddhism and Jainism is an interrogation of caste and rejection of caste. I mean, every reform movement in Indian history has foregrounded caste. And yet it persists. And I think what, as both social scientists and as activists also, we need to ask ourselves the question, what is it in caste which makes it so persevering that despite such a long history of interrogation of caste, this is where we are today. Okay, that is one. Now, what I'm asking you is, for instance, as a person at my age, I'm asking the youth of India, are you going to tolerate love jihad? Are you going to tolerate honor killing? Because I think at the root of it is the assertion of difference and identity and the denial of the freedom of choice to mingle across caste and religion. Now how will you fight caste, you tell me? How will you fight it? Either you have to fight it in the structures, land, production, capital, or you will have to fight it in the urban domain in different respects, in terms of equality in the universities, equal access and opportunity. But what equal access will you get in a neoliberal economy which is premised on growing inequality? It is premised on inequality. This system that we are in today, the development paths and practices. And what I was trying to say, what did Towards Equality say? Towards Equality made a very key statement. It said it is not in mindset and custom. It is the inequality and marginalization women suffer from today. The disabilities, the social disabilities they suffer from are rooted and go alongside the path of development that modern India is adopting. I am saying this is modern India. This is not just history. Love jihad is modern India. Honor crime is modern India today. Okay? It may have had a history, fine. I mean, I've had a history in my own family. I'm not talking about it here. But I know, long before honor crime became the vocabulary in the movement, I have had to take up those issues in my personal experience. But my point is today, neoliberal modern India and this hyper-nationalism that we are seeing is being premised on these concepts and on these concepts which are being given legislative form with no challenge. And if they are being challenged, your courts may be saying these are my rights as part of my identity. I mean, an absolute denial of human rights, an absolute denial of freedom of choice, freedom of democratic rights. And it is also linked to land and property. In Haryana, I can tell you, which in North India, in Haryana and UP, the Jats are the land-owning communities. If Jat girls marry a Dalit boy, what happens? This Dalit girl, this Jat girl gets a right. She already, the Constitution and Hindu Marriage Act, Hindu HSA 2005 also give her the right to inherit property. This property will go into the hands of a Dalit boy, Dalit youth. It upsets the land and property and caste alignment in the village. Absolutely, it immediately upsets these. They will not accept it. Now, it's at the heart of the problem. Land, property, succession are at the heart of these problems in rural India. Urban India, we're talking about a different domain where structures, opportunities, assets, production resources, they are in different form, in different shape. But what I'm saying is, if we only go by the markers of identity, we may not be able to lead the fight at the different levels that it needs to be fought. You know, when you understand the problem, you have to understand it in its complexity. I can't fight. I mean, I can't go and lead the agrarian revolution and fight land monopoly in India. But in my mind as an academic, and that's why since this is part of a faculty development program, what I'm saying is, you know, I may look at the microcosm of a problem, but that microcosm of the problem is rooted in a larger social reality. I mean, I'm not going to be able to fight globalization, but as a social scientist, as an academic, and as an activist, I have to understand that it is this global reality which is shaping this world. Imperialism is not dead and gone. Yes, the British left in 1947. But is imperialism dead and gone? If it were dead and gone, then what is happening in Afghanistan today? We need to ask ourselves, what is nationalism? I mean, we don't fight imperialism, but we are nationalists. So you have a construction of nationalism which is complicit with imperialism, totally complicit with imperialism. It is totally complicit with feudal authority in Indian social structure. And yet it is nationalist. Now, the whole freedom struggle in India was anti-feudal, anti-imperialist. But today you can have a construction of nationalism which has no relation, no commitment to either of these two primary objectives of the freedom struggle. Primary objectives within which women's battle for their rights was grounded. I mean, women were fighting in the peasantry, women were fighting. They were fighting as workers. Okay? But if we don't fight there and we say, no, I should have the right to sit on the same chair as you, of course it is a fight, because a panchayat woman who's not being allowed to sit on a chair because she's a Dalit, she has every right to lead that fight. Okay? But you look at where they will catch you. They will pass no confidence. There are studies. Nirmala Buch did a study of how many Dalit women in the panchayats faced no confidence motions. No confidence motions, and they were removed. Then you have this two-child norm in Haryana. The Edwa challenged and went to the court, saying how you do not provide schools in the villages, but you are bringing in an order which says that to contest panchayat elections, I have to qualify to at least have passed class 8, man or woman. But you will not provide a school in my village. And the Supreme Court upholds that order. You tell me. So, I mean, what I'm saying is, what you achieve through the legal domain of rights is being undermined and reversed in other ways. It is being reversed in other ways. So you have to be sensitive to the multi-layered, as you said it, these are the words. But, it cannot be only in the domain of identity. The domain of identity is one crucial aspect. But the structures and the structural embeddedness of principles of inequality and hierarchies have to be kept in mind if we want these battles to succeed. Yeah? Sorry, I think I've really taken a long time. I'm getting a phone call. I'm not sure if it's someone from your organizer saying, please now stop.
No, that's not for us.
Yeah.
So thank you very much once again for the insightful talk and the discussion, Dr. Indu. Now, I think we can call it a day now to the participants.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
So we will be starting the tomorrow's session at 2 o'clock. So we request the participants to be present in the meeting around 1:50, 1:55, not to wait till 2 o'clock, because at 2 o'clock the resource persons will be ready. So we have to be ready for them to start. And in tomorrow's session, we will be talking about, it is kind of a prelude to the following discussions on the other days. We will talk about understanding gender, and understanding gender from two different points of view, which are equally important and which are basic to the understanding of gender. And it is not an academic session on gender as we do in our gender study sessions. For those of you who belong to the literature or social science sectors, we will be talking our understanding gender from the perspective of medical sciences, perspective of evolution, and also from the perspective of the gender and sexual minorities, including the LGBT community. So we request all of you to be present in the meeting at around 1:50, 1:55 by the latest. So thank you for your participation and for participating in the discussions too. We hope to see you all at 1:55 tomorrow. Thank you.